The attic door slammed shut behind me. A masked figure lunged from the shadows. My mother's keycard clattered to the floor. The brass lamp in my hands was my only weapon. One wrong move, and the ledger proving her betrayal would be buried with me. The trunk crashed into my attacker's knees. I grabbed the keycard, my fingers shaking. The dates in the ledger didn't lie. She'd been pulling strings from her hospital bed. And now, someone was here to silence me. Dust motes danced in the shafts of gray light, piercing the attic's single circular window, illuminating a world of forgotten things. Elena Vance's knees crunched against the grid of unfinished floorboards as she shoved aside a stack of water-damaged encyclopedias. The air tasted of cedar and stagnant humidity, thickening her throat with every breath. Her mother's medical bills sat like a lead weight in her mind, demanding the insurance policy Margaret insisted lay hidden among these relics. Margaret was currently confined to a bed at the Lakeview Rehabilitation Center, her voice reduced to a fragile whisper after the stroke. But even from a hospital bed, she managed to direct Elena's every move with the precision of a conductor. Elena's fingers brushed the rough edge of a steamer trunk buried under a moth-eaten wool blanket. The rusted latch groaned, resisting her pull until it gave way with a sharp, metallic snap that echoed through the hollow space. Inside lay a collection of porcelain dolls with cracked, glassy stares, their Victorian lace yellowed by decades of neglect. She dug deeper, her nails catching on a heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. The bundle slid out, heavier than a stack of papers. She unwound the fabric to reveal a leather ledger, its surface scarred by deep, deliberate gouges. Gold leaf flickered under a layer of grime, spelling out Project Sanctuary. Elena traced the embossed letters, her thumb catching on the texture of the hide. The leather smelled of old smoke and chemical preservatives, a sharp contrast to the musty attic air. She cracked the spine, expecting to find policy numbers or premium receipts for the Vance estate. Instead, rows of handwritten dates marched across the yellowed pages, flanked by names she recognized from the local evening news, judges, bank directors, and city council members. A photograph drifted from between the leaves, fluttering to the floorboards. In the grainy black and white image, a younger Margaret stood before a concrete facility, her face stripped of the warmth Elena remembered, replaced by a rigid, terrifying clinical stare. The silence of the attic suddenly felt heavy, pressing against her eardrums like a rising tide. She sat back on her heels, the ledger heavy in her lap. The dates in the book weren't just random notations. They were a timeline of Elena's own life. She began to read, her eyes scanning the elegant, looping script she had seen on thousands of grocery lists and birthday cards. But these entries weren't about milk or well wishes. October 14th. The Henderson boy is becoming a distraction. One entry read, E is showing signs of genuine attachment. Intervention required. Letter drafted to M regarding the other girl. Elena felt a cold prickle dance across her skin. Mark Henderson, the man she had been set to marry 5 years ago. The man who had suddenly, inexplicably, walked away after a series of misunderstandings that had seemed like tragic accidents of timing. She remembered the letters, the ones Mark had supposedly sent her, filled with coldness and talk of a former flame in Chicago. She had seen the ink on the page. She had recognized his signature, or she thought she had. She turned the pages faster now, her breath coming in shallow hitches. The ledger detailed a systematic dismantling of her relationship. It recorded the nights Margaret had faked palpitations to interrupt their dates, the phone calls intercepted, and the forged correspondence designed to make Mark believe Elena was only using him for his family's connections. It was a masterpiece of social engineering, executed with the patient cruelty of a spider weaving a web. Margaret hadn't just been a difficult mother. She had been an architect of Elena's loneliness. The realization was a physical blow, a dull ache that started in her chest and radiated outward. Every crisis Margaret had suffered during Elena's 20s was listed here as a strategic event, the stroke that had brought Elena back to Shaker Heights just last month. She looked for it at the end of the book. The entries continued right up to the present day. A floorboard creaked behind her. Elena froze. The sound hadn't come from the settling of the old house. It was the distinct, heavy press of a boot on wood. She didn't turn around immediately. Her forensic mind, trained to spot the tiniest flaw in a canvas, was already calculating the distance to the attic stairs. The air in the attic, once merely stagnant, now felt charged with a sudden, violent electricity. A shadow stretched across the floorboards, cutting through the gray light of the circular window. Elena gripped the heavy leather ledger, her knuckles white. She didn't have time to process the betrayal of the past. The present was suddenly much more dangerous. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. The answer was the sound of a heavy metallic object, a crowbar, striking the side of a wooden crate. A figure stepped out from behind a stack of old furniture. They wore a dark hoodie and a tactical mask that obscured everything but a pair of cold, unblinking eyes. The intruder didn't speak. They lunged. Elena scrambled backward, her heels catching on the uneven floor. The crowbar swung in a wide arc, whistling through the air and smashing into the porcelain dolls she had just uncovered. Shards of white ceramic exploded like shrapnel. Elena's hand flew to her pocket, her fingers finding the smooth riverstone she always carried. She rubbed it once, twice. No. There wasn't time for rituals. She grabbed a brass floor lamp standing nearby, its cord trailing like a dead snake. As the intruder stepped forward for a second swing, Elena swung the lamp with every ounce of strength she possessed. The heavy base connected with the attacker's shoulder with a dull thud. The man grunted, the sound muffled by his mask, and stumbled back. Elena didn't wait for him to recover. She grabbed the heavy steamer trunk, the one that had held her mother's secrets, and gave it a desperate, adrenaline-fueled shove. The trunk slid across the dusty floor, its metal corners screeching. It caught the intruder across the shins just as he was regaining his balance. He let out a sharp cry of pain and toppled backward, disappearing down the steep, narrow attic stairs. The sound of his body hitting the landing below was a series of sickening thuds. Elena stood at the top of the stairs, the brass lamp still clutched in her hands, her chest heaving. She waited, listening for the sound of him coming back up. Instead, she heard the heavy front door of the house slam shut, followed by the screech of tires on the driveway. She was shaking, a fine tremor that started in her knees and worked its way up. She looked down at her feet. There, near the top step, lay a small plastic rectangle that hadn't been there before. It was a keycard, white and clinical, with a magnetic strip along the back. Elena knelt and picked it up with trembling fingers. Printed in small blue letters at the bottom was the logo for the Lakeview Rehabilitation Center. Above it, a name: M. Davis, staff. The air in the attic smelled of scorched dust and the metallic tang of the brass lamp. Elena looked from the keycard to the ledger still lying on the floor. Her mother was in that facility. Her mother was supposed to be paralyzed on her left side, unable to speak more than a few words at a time. And yet, a member of the staff from that very building had just tried to kill her in her own attic. The proxy. Margaret wasn't just watching from her sickbed. She had an enforcer. Elena pressed the keycard into her palm, the sharp plastic edge biting into her skin. The Project Sanctuary wasn't a relic of the past. It was an ongoing operation, and she was the primary target. The house felt different now. No longer a sanctuary, but a cage designed by a woman who knew every one of Elena's weaknesses. Elena knew she couldn't stay here. She needed to know what that keycard opened. She needed to know how deep the forgery of her life actually went. She moved through the house with a newfound, cold clarity. She packed a small bag, throwing in the ledger and a few essentials. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump, her ears straining for the rhythmic pop, pop, pop of knuckles she had heard in the hallways of the rehab center when she visited her mother. Michael Davis. The nurse with the thick neck and the unblinking stare. He was the one who had been caring for Margaret. Elena headed for the garage, her mind racing. If Davis was the attacker, he had dropped his access to something important. She remembered the storage units just 3 miles down the road, the ones Margaret had insisted on paying for years ago, claiming they held family heirlooms that wouldn't fit in the Shaker Heights house. She drove through the manicured streets of the neighborhood, the identical wreaths on the front doors looking like funeral floral arrangements in the fading light. The storage facility was a sprawling complex of corrugated metal and chain-link fences. She pulled up to the gate and held the stolen keycard to the sensor. A soft beep signaled the gate's release. The heavy metal barrier slid open with a mechanical groan. Elena drove deep into the labyrinth of units until she found the one registered to the Vance estate. Unit 402. She stepped out of the car, the smell of mothballs and damp concrete hitting her instantly. She slid the keycard into the unit's electronic lock. The light turned green. Inside, the unit wasn't filled with furniture or old clothes. It was lined with industrial-grade filing cabinets and stacked crates. Elena opened the nearest crate. Inside were reams of corporate letterheads, official seals from the city auditor's office, and stacks of documents that appeared to be private financial records from some of the biggest firms in Cleveland. She pulled out a folder. It was labeled with her own name. Inside were confessions, written in her handwriting, admitting to industrial espionage and the theft of trade secrets. There were bank statements showing massive deposits into an account in her name she had never opened. Margaret hadn't just sabotaged her past. She had prefabricated a criminal future for her daughter. If Elena ever tried to expose her mother, Margaret had a kill switch ready, a mountain of forged evidence that would send Elena to prison for life. Elena felt the world tilt. She reached for her phone, her thumb hovering over Mark's name in her contacts. He was the only one who might believe her, the only one who knew the Vance family well enough to understand the depth of the madness. She hit call. The screen of her smartphone flickered. A line of green text scrolled across the display, too fast to read. Then the screen went black. A small icon of a padlock appeared in the center, followed by the words, "Device wiped. Factory reset initiated. No," Elena whispered, tapping the screen frantically. No, no, no. The phone grew warm in her hand as the software systematically ate itself. Documents, photos, contacts. Every digital shred of her existence was being dissolved remotely. She was being erased in real time. The technological isolation was total. She was standing in a dark storage unit, surrounded by evidence of her supposed crimes, with no way to call for help. The silence of the storage facility was broken by a distant, rhythmic thudding. A jackhammer? No, it was too slow. It was the sound of a heavy vehicle idling near the entrance. Elena retreated to her car, her heart drumming against her ribs. She needed to get back to the house, to the physical backup drive she kept hidden in the study. It was the only thing she had left, a hard copy of her research into the Vance estate's finances. She drove back to Shaker Heights, her eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. A black SUV followed her at a distance, its headlights off, a predatory shape in the twilight. She pulled into her driveway, scrambled out of the car, and bolted for the front door. Inside, the house was stiflingly hot. The thermostat had been cranked up to 90 degrees, the air thick and smelling of scorched dust. She ran to the study, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The backup drive was hidden behind a row of law books on the heavy oak bookshelf. As she reached for the shelf, she heard a sharp metallic ping, the sound of a bolt snapping under tension. The massive bookshelf, 6 feet of solid oak and hundreds of pounds of books, began to tilt. Elena lunged to the side, her shoulder hitting the floor just as the shelf collapsed with a thunderous crash that shook the entire house. Dust erupted in a choking cloud. The spot where she had been standing seconds before was now buried under a mountain of wood and paper. The floorboards beneath the shelf had been pre-sawn, the supports replaced with thin, brittle shims. It wasn't an accident. It was a deadfall. Elena lay on the floor, coughing, her lungs burning. Through the settling dust, she heard the front door open. Then, the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of knuckles cracking. 1212. Michael Davis stepped into the study. He wasn't wearing the mask now. His nursing scrubs were pristine, but his eyes were wide and manic. He held a heavy pipe wrench in one hand, the cold steel gleaming in the dim light. "Your mother is very disappointed, Elena," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "She wanted this to be painless. She wanted you to just fade away." Elena scrambled backward, her hand hitting a heavy glass paperweight on the floor. "She's paying you to kill her own daughter? Do you have any idea what's in that ledger, Michael? You're just a loose end to her." Davis laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "I'm the one who makes sure the ends stay tied." He lunged. Elena rolled under the heavy oak desk, the wrench slamming into the wood above her head with a splintering crack. She kicked out, her boot catching Davis in the shin. He grunted but didn't slow down. He was a man built for violence, his movements efficient and heavy. Elena scrambled out from under the desk and bolted for the garage. It was the only part of the house with a heavy, locking door. She slammed it shut and threw the deadbolt just as Davis's weight hit the other side. The wood groaned, but held. "Open the door, Elena!" Davis shouted, his voice muffled. "You're making this so much harder than it needs to be." Elena backed away from the door, her eyes scanning the garage. She saw the heavy mechanism for the electric garage door, the old-fashioned chain drive that Margaret had refused to upgrade. Davis was throwing his shoulder against the door now, the hinges screaming. Elena grabbed a heavy metal rake and jammed it into the door's track, then hit the close button on the wall. The garage door began to descend, but the rake prevented it from seating properly. The motor strained, the chain rattling violently. Davis, seeing the gap at the bottom of the garage door, dropped to his knees and tried to slide under, thinking it was his way in. But Elena wasn't trying to let him in. She pulled the rake out at the last second. The heavy steel door slammed down with the full force of its weight and the straining motor. It caught Davis's arm just above the elbow. A sickening crack echoed through the garage, followed by a scream of pure, unadulterated agony. Davis was pinned, his arm crushed beneath the steel edge of the door. He thrashed, his face pressed against the concrete driveway outside, his screams echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Elena didn't stay to watch. She ran to the SUV Davis had left idling in the driveway. She needed to know what else he had. She needed more than just a ledger. She needed proof of the conspiracy. Subverted. Elena climbed into the driver's seat of the black SUV. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely grip the steering wheel, but she forced herself to breathe. Think like a curator, she told herself. Look for the flaw in the composition. She began to tear the interior apart. She checked the glove box, the center console, and finally, the sun visor. A thick manila folder slid out. Elena's heart leaped. This was it. The physical evidence of Davis's instructions, the proof that he was acting on Margaret's orders. She opened the folder, her eyes searching for the smoking gun that would clear her name and put Davis behind bars forever. The first document was a restraining order. It was signed by Jennifer Martinez, Elena's oldest friend. The second was from Mark Henderson. The third was from Christopher Brown, the local police sergeant. Elena's brow furrowed. These weren't instructions for a hit. They were legal documents. She began to read the affidavits attached to them. Jennifer Martinez had sworn under oath that Elena had been stalking her, showing up at her house at midnight and screaming through the mail slot. Mark Henderson's statement detailed repeated threats of self-harm used to manipulate him into staying in the relationship. No, Elena whispered, the paper crinkling in her grip. This isn't right. I haven't seen Jennifer in months. She looked closer at the signatures. They were perfect. The ink was the right weight, the flourishes identical to her friend's handwriting. To any court, to any police officer, these were legitimate. A wave of relief washed over her. This was the flaw. Margaret had overreached. If Elena took these to the police right now, she could show them that they were forgeries. She was a forensic art expert. She could prove the chemical composition of the ink didn't match the dates on the documents. She could show that the signatures, while visually perfect, lacked the natural tremor of a human hand. This was her win. She would drive straight to the station, present this folder, and have the authorities escort her to the rehab center to arrest her mother. The nightmare was finally ending because she was smart enough to see the fraud. She put the SUV in gear and backed out of the driveway, leaving Davis screaming in the garage. She felt a surge of triumph. She had the evidence. She had the expertise. She was going to win. She pulled into the police station parking lot 5 minutes later. She didn't even turn off the engine. She grabbed the folder and ran inside, her face flushed with the first real hope she'd felt in weeks. Sergeant Christopher Brown was at the front desk. He looked up, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Before Elena could speak, his expression hardened. He didn't look at her with the warmth of an old family friend. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Elena," he said, his voice flat. "You shouldn't be here." "Chris, look at this," she said, shoving the folder toward him. "These are forgeries. My mother, she's using Michael Davis to frame me. Look at the signatures, the ink off-gassing." Chris didn't look at the folder. He reached for his radio. "I have the subject in the lobby. Send backup." "Chris, what are you doing?" Elena's voice rose. "I'm telling you, these documents are fake." "We know they're fake, Elena," Chris said, stepping around the desk. "Because you're the one who's been sending them. We've had 3 complaints this morning from your friends. They say you've been calling them, playing recorded voices of your mother, threatening to release forged documents to ruin their reputations unless they give you money." The world tilted. Elena looked down at the folder in her hand. She realized with a sickening jolt that the folder hadn't been left behind by Davis. It had been planted. I haven't called anyone, she stammered. We have the records, Elena. Your phone number, your voice. Chris's face was a mask of cold duty. The restraining orders in that folder, they aren't forgeries against you. They're the ones your friends filed because of your behavior this morning. And by bringing them here, by showing you have copies of documents that haven't even been served yet, you just proved you've been intercepting legal mail. The trap snapped shut. Margaret hadn't just isolated Elena. She had turned Elena's own defense into a confession. By being smart and finding the evidence, Elena had walked right into a preset legal ambush. Turn around, Chris said, his hand moving toward the handcuffs on his belt. You're under arrest for stalking, extortion, and violation of a protective order. Elena didn't turn around. She bolted. She slammed through the glass doors of the station and dove back into the SUV. She floored it, the tires screaming on the asphalt. She didn't have a plan anymore. She only had one destination left: the Lakeview Rehabilitation Center. She had to see her mother. She had to look into those pale, translucent eyes and find the woman who had replaced her daughter's life with a high-stakes forgery. The storm broke as she hit the highway. Rain lashed against the windshield in great, shimmering sheets, the sky turning a bruised purple. Thunder shook the frame of the SUV, a rhythmic drumming that matched the frantic pulse in Elena's throat. She reached the rehab center, the building a white monolith against the gray sky. She used Davis's keycard one last time at the service entrance. The lock clicked, and she slipped inside, the air smelling of floor wax and antiseptic. She bypassed the elevators, taking the stairs 2 at a time. She reached the 4th floor, the private suites. The hallway was silent, the only sound the hum of the air conditioning and the distant flicker of a fluorescent light. She reached Suite 412. The door was heavy oak, the brass handle cold in her hand. She pushed it open. The room was dark, lit only by the rhythmic flash of lightning outside. A figure stood by the window, silhouetted against the storm. They were tall, straight-backed, and perfectly still. "Mother?" Elena whispered. The figure turned. Margaret Vance didn't have a walker. She wasn't wearing a hospital gown. She was dressed in a sharp silk suit, her hair perfectly coiffed. The paralyzed left side of her face was smooth, her eyes bright and predatory. "You always were a fast learner, Elena," Margaret said. Her voice wasn't a whisper. It was a sharp, resonant command. But you never learned when to stop digging. The stroke had been a lie. The entire hospitalization had been a staging ground, a way to lure Elena back into the house where the traps had been set. "Why?" Elena asked, her voice breaking. "Mark, my job, my friends. Why destroy everything?" Margaret stepped closer, the smell of her expensive perfume cloying in the small room. "Because you were leaving, darling. You were going to take your little brushes and your little stones and move to Europe. You were going to leave me alone in that house with nothing but the dust." She reached out, her hand stroking Elena's cheek. The touch was cold, clinical. "I couldn't let that happen. Project Sanctuary was never about the estate, Elena. It was about you. Keeping you safe. Keeping you here, where I can see you." Margaret pulled a small silver tray from the bedside table. On it lay a syringe, filled with a clear, viscous liquid. "The doctors already agree you're having a psychotic break," Margaret whispered. "A little sedation, a few months in the high-security wing. You'll finally be the daughter I always wanted. Quiet, dependent, mine." Margaret lunged with surprising, wiry strength. She grabbed Elena's hair, pulling her head back, the needle gleaming in the lightning. Elena fought, her hands clawing at her mother's wrists. They crashed into the medical monitor, the screen shattering with a spray of sparks. The two women grappled on the floor, a tangle of silk and desperation. Elena felt the needle graze her arm, the cold sting of the metal. She rolled, pinning Margaret against the bed frame. She grabbed a glass water pitcher from the nightstand and smashed it against the metal rail. Shards of glass flew, cutting Elena's hand, but she didn't let go. She used the jagged remains of the pitcher to force the syringe out of Margaret's hand. The needle skittered across the floor, disappearing under the radiator. Margaret let out a low, guttural growl and lunged again, her fingers digging into Elena's throat. She was stronger than she looked, fueled by a lifetime of calculated rage. Elena felt her vision begin to blur, the air trapped in her lungs. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers closed around the riverstone. She didn't rub it 7 times. She gripped it like a weapon and slammed it into the side of Margaret's head. Margaret gasped, her grip loosening. Elena shoved her off, scrambling to her feet, her chest heaving. Margaret lay on the floor, a thin trickle of blood running down her temple, her eyes wide with shock. Subverted, Elena stood over her mother, the riverstone still clutched in her bloody hand. "It's over, Mother. I'm calling the police. I'm telling them everything. I have the ledger. I have Davis's arm in the garage. They'll have to believe me now." Margaret didn't look afraid. She began to weep, not a silent, dignified cry, but a loud, racking sob. She tore her own silk blouse, scratched at her own face, and began to scream for help. "Please, someone help me. She's trying to kill me." The door to the suite burst open. Sergeant Chris Brown and 2 other officers rushed in, guns drawn. They didn't see a criminal mother. They saw a disheveled, bleeding Elena Vance standing over a frail, weeping woman in a hospital room. "Drop it!" Chris shouted. "Elena, drop the stone." "Chris, she's faking. Look at her. She was standing up. She attacked me with a needle." "I said drop it." Elena let the stone fall. It hit the floor with a dull clack. The officers tackled her, slamming her face first into the carpet. The smell of the floor wax was overwhelming. As they ratcheted the handcuffs onto her wrists, Elena looked up. Margaret was being helped into a chair by a nurse. She looked over the nurse's shoulder at Elena. The tears were gone. Her face was a mask of cold, triumphant satisfaction. She mouthed 2 words, "My girl." "We found the ledger in her car," one of the officers said, holding up the Project Sanctuary book. "It's full of her delusions. She's been writing about her mother for years, planning this confrontation." Elena realized with a final, crushing clarity. The ledger wasn't Margaret's diary. Margaret had written it in Elena's handwriting. Every entry, every discovery in the attic, had been a forgery designed to be found. The Project Sanctuary wasn't Margaret's secret. It was the name of the psychiatric defense Margaret had built to ensure Elena would be committed. "She's insane," Margaret whispered to the sergeant, her voice once again a fragile, tragic reed. "Please, just get her the help she needs." Elena was dragged from the room, her screams for justice echoing down the sterile, white hallway, sounding to everyone else exactly like the break she was accused of having. She was locked in a holding room in the psychiatric wing, the walls a soft, padded white that seemed to absorb her very existence. Hours passed. The storm outside subsided, leaving a heavy, humid silence. A detective she didn't recognize entered the room. He was a younger man, with tired eyes and a coffee stain on his tie. He sat down across from her and laid the ledger on the table. "My name is Detective Miller," he said. "I've been going over your journal, Elena." "It's not mine," Elena said, her voice hoarse. "It's a forgery. My mother, she's a master. She can mimic any hand." Miller sighed. "That's a hell of a claim. But I'm an art history minor, Elena. I know your work at the museum. I know you're the best forensic curator in the state." Elena looked up, a spark of hope flickering. "Then you know. You can see the flaws." "I see something else," Miller said. He pulled a small device from his pocket, an industrial sensor used for detecting chemical off-gassing. "I ran this over the restraining orders you brought to the station, and over the ledger." He leaned in. "The ink on the old entries from 10 years ago? It's still emitting high levels of solvent. In fact, the ink on the first page is exactly as fresh as the ink on the last page. This whole book was written in the last 48 hours. Elena's breath hitched. "The off-gassing. She was in a rush. She couldn't wait for the ink to cure." "And then there's Michael Davis," Miller continued. "We found him in your garage. He's currently in surgery. But we also found his phone. He didn't wipe it as well as he wiped yours. We found the wire transfers from your mother's private offshore account. And we found the life insurance policy." He slid a document across the table. It was a policy for $5 million, taken out on Elena Vance. The beneficiary was Margaret Vance. The policy had a double indemnity clause for accidental death, like a bookshelf falling or a car accident. "She wasn't just trying to commit you," Miller said quietly. "She was the one who was going to inherit when you finally had your accident. The Project Sanctuary was her retirement plan." The weight of the betrayal was almost too much to bear. But for the first time in her life, Elena felt the truth was a solid thing, something that couldn't be forged away. The climax was swift and clinical. Faced with the forensic evidence of the ink and the digital trail of the insurance fraud, Margaret's composure didn't just crack. It disintegrated. When the police entered her suite to arrest her, she began to scream, not for help, but at the clumsiness of the world that had failed to recognize her genius. She was led out of the Lakeview Rehabilitation Center in handcuffs, her silk suit wrinkled, her hair a wild, silver mess. Elena didn't watch her leave. She was already back at the Shaker Heights house, standing in the middle of the ruined study. She looked at the fallen bookshelf, the shattered porcelain, and the dusty relics of a life that had been a lie. She didn't feel sadness. She felt a profound, hollow lightness. She called a realtor and told them to list the house as is. She didn't want the furniture. She didn't want the silver. She wanted nothing that smelled of cedar or scorched dust. 3 months later, Elena Vance sat in a bright, glass-walled coffee shop in Seattle. The air smelled of roasted beans and rain, real rain, not the cloying humidity of Ohio. The sound of the espresso machine was a sharp, aggressive hiss, but it didn't make her flinch. She was looking at a painting on the wall, a local artist's rendition of the Puget Sound. It was messy, the brushstrokes bold and imperfect. A man sat down at the table next to her. He had a kind face and held a book on architecture. "It's a bit much, isn't it?" he asked, nodding toward the painting. "The blue is almost too bright to be real." Elena looked at the painting. She didn't analyze the pigment or the provenance. She didn't look for the flaw. "I think it's exactly as bright as it needs to be," she said. She reached into her pocket and felt the smooth river stone. She didn't rub it. She just held it, a small, solid piece of the earth. and for the first time in 32 years, she didn't feel like she was disappearing into the blackness. The architect of her misery was gone, and the canvas of her life was finally, beautifully, blank.